In the spring of 1851, a notice appeared in the back pages of the New Orleans Picayune that no one should have paid attention to. Estate sale, it read. One Negro male, approximately 25 years, field hand, sound body, refuses name, distinguishing mark, singular green eye. Starting bid, $200. $200. In 1851, a healthy male slave in Louisiana sold for $1,200 to $1,500. This wasn't a discount. This was desperation. The man placing that advertisement was Gerard Beaumont, owner of Cypress Grove Plantation, one of the wealthiest sugar operations in Street Mary Parish. 3 months earlier, Beaumont had paid $1,400 for that same slave. Now he was willing to lose over $1,000 just to be rid of him. And Beaumont wasn't the first. He was the seventh. Between January and May of 1851, this man had been bought and sold 7 times. 7 different owners. 7 transactions, each one at a steeper loss than the last. The pattern was so unusual that New Orleans slave traders began keeping informal records, passing warnings in the back rooms of auction houses. The man with the green eye. 1 week, that's all it ever took. What could one man do in 7 days to make plantation owners, men who'd built fortunes on human suffering, choose financial ruin over keeping him another week? The answer involves no violence, no rebellion, no escape attempts. What this man did was far more dangerous than any of those things. He simply looked at people, and when he looked at them, they saw something they'd spent their entire lives trying not to see. Before we go deeper into this story that's been buried for over 170 years, I need to tell you something. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of slavery's horrors. This is about a form of resistance so subtle, so psychologically devastating, that it terrified slaveholders more than any uprising. If that interests you, you'll want to stay until the end, because the truth about what happened to this man is stranger than anything I could invent. The first record appears in a shipping manifest. The vessel Arethusa out of Havana made port in New Orleans on January 8, 1851. Among the cargo manifest, 180 barrels of sugar, 42 bales of tobacco, and 23 souls listed simply as African merchandise. The ship's doctor, a man named Philip Devereaux, kept private medical notes that survived in his family's papers. One entry stands out. Male, 20 to 30 years of age, unusual ocular condition, right eye brown, left eye vivid green, unlike any coloration I have observed in my 15 years of maritime medicine. The African shows no signs of disease, but there is something in his bearing that troubles the crew. He does not resist, does not speak, but watches everything with an attention that makes men uncomfortable. The captain has ordered him kept separate from the others. New Orleans in 1851 was the beating heart of the American slave trade. More human beings were bought and sold in that city than anywhere else in the nation. The auctions happened daily at the Street Louis Hotel, in private exchange houses along Chartres Street, in the pens near the waterfront, where the smell of the Mississippi mixed with human sweat and fear. Buyers came from across the South. Plantation owners, speculators, agents representing wealthy families. They knew what they wanted. They examined teeth, muscles, hands. They asked questions. They paid for expertise. The market ran on cold calculation. The man from the Arethusa was sold on January 10th to a speculator named Raymond Fouché. Fouché's business was simple. Buy low in New Orleans, sell high in the interior parishes where labor was scarce and prices were better. He paid $800 for the man with the green eye, below market value, because the unusual eye coloration made some buyers nervous. Superstitious fools, Fouché thought. He planned to resell within the week for at least $1,200. Fouché kept the man in his holding pen on Tchoupitoulas Street, along with 30 other slaves awaiting transport or resale. The pen consisted of a courtyard surrounded by high walls, small cells for sleeping, an office where Fouché conducted business. He'd run this operation for 12 years without incident. The man was given no name. In Fouche's ledger he appears only as Green Eye Male, Lot 47. He was fed the standard ration, cornmeal and salt pork. He was assigned to sleep in a cell with 4 others. He was brought out twice for prospective buyers to examine. Both times the buyers declined. One, a planter from Assumption Parish, told Fouche, "Something about him makes me uneasy. Can't explain it. I'll take that other fellow instead." On the 4th day, something happened that Fouche's assistant, a free man of color named Baptiste Caron, later described in testimony given years afterward. Baptiste had worked for Fouche for 8 years. He'd seen thousands of enslaved people pass through the pens. He'd learned to view them, as Fouche did, as inventory, as investment, as economic units. "I went to bring the evening ration," Baptiste testified. The green-eyed man was sitting in the corner of the cell, perfectly still, perfectly quiet. The others were talking among themselves, but he just sat there. When I put down the food, he looked at me. Just looked at me. And in that moment, I saw myself as I actually was. Not what I told myself I was. Not a businessman helping to run a legitimate enterprise, but a man who made his living from other people's suffering. A man who'd chosen comfort over conscience. I saw it all in an instant, reflected in that green eye, and I couldn't unsee it. Baptiste walked out of the pen that night and never came back. He forfeited a week's wages. He never explained his reasons to anyone who asked. Fouche noticed Baptiste's absence the next morning, but he had more pressing concerns. Over the previous 2 days, he'd felt increasingly agitated. His sleep had become troubled. When he looked at his records, at the neat columns of purchases and sales, profits and losses, he felt something he'd never felt before: shame. On the morning of the 6th day, Fouche sold the green-eyed man to a plantation owner named Etienne Marchant for $650, a $150 loss. When Marchant asked if there was any defect in the slave, Fouche replied, "No defect I can name. I simply want him gone." Marchant owned Belle Rive, a sugar plantation 30 miles upriver from New Orleans. 2,000 acres of cane fields, 160 enslaved people, a mansion with Doric columns that could be seen from the river. Marchant was a 3rd-generation planter, a man who'd inherited wealth and added to it through ruthless efficiency. The green-eyed man arrived at Belle Rive on January 18th. Marchant's overseer, a German immigrant named Klaus Weber, recorded the acquisition in the plantation journal. New field hand, no name given, assigned designation Marcus, placed in 3rd gang, unusual eye condition noted. Belle Rive operated with mechanical precision. The enslaved population was divided into gangs based on strength and ability. Work began before sunrise and continued until dark. The sugar harvest season was underway, the most brutal time of year when 18-hour days were common and the mills ran continuously, grinding cane into raw sugar that would make Marchant richer with each passing week. Marcus, as he was now called, was assigned to the cutting gang. Sugar cane cutting is vicious work. The stalks grow 12 feet high, with edges sharp as razors. The Louisiana heat is merciless. Men swung machetes from dawn until their hands bled, their backs screaming, their vision blurring from exhaustion. Marcus worked without complaint. He learned the rhythm quickly, matched the pace of men who'd done it their entire lives. The overseer found nothing to fault. He didn't lag, didn't resist, didn't cause trouble. He simply worked. But something was happening at Belle Rive, something the overseer couldn't name. On the 3rd day, Klaus Weber mentioned to Marchant that several of the drivers, enslaved men who supervised the work gangs, had requested that Marcus be moved to a different crew. When Weber asked why, they couldn't articulate it. "Something about him troubles us," was all they would say. On the 4th day, Weber himself began to feel it. He found himself avoiding Marcus. When he had to give instructions to the crew Marcus worked with, he addressed other men, not Marcus directly. Not because Marcus was defiant or insubordinate, because when Marcus looked at him, Weber felt judged in a way he couldn't explain. That night, Weber drank half a bottle of whiskey, unusual for a man known for his discipline. His wife asked what was wrong. "I don't know," he told her. "I feel as though I'm doing something terrible, but I'm only doing my job. The same job I've done for 5 years." On the 5th day, Marchant himself went to the fields, something he rarely did during harvest, when his presence was needed at the sugar mill. He wanted to see this slave who was causing such strange reactions. He found Marcus in the cutting line, working steadily. Marchant approached, ordered him to stop. "Look at me," Marchant said. Marcus looked. One brown eye, one green eye, both completely calm, completely present. Marchant later told his wife that in that moment he felt something collapse inside him. "I have owned slaves my entire adult life," he said. "I have told myself it's natural, that it's God's order, that they're suited for this life. But when that man looked at me, I saw the lie. I saw what I've built, what my father built, what we've all built. And I saw that it's built on nothing but our willingness to believe our own stories." On the morning of the 7th day, Etienne Marchand took Marcus back to New Orleans and sold him to the first trader who would take him for $500. The trader's name was John Caldwell, and his specialty was difficult sales. Slaves who'd run away before, slaves with scars from whippings, slaves who'd been sold multiple times. Caldwell bought cheap and sold to buyers who couldn't afford to be picky. Small farmers in remote parishes, industrial operations that chewed through workers. Caldwell paid $500 for Marcus and planned to sell him to a turpentine camp in the piney woods near the Texas border. Hard work, dangerous conditions, high mortality, but they paid cash and didn't ask questions. But first, Caldwell kept Marcus in his own facility for 3 days while he arranged transportation. That was a mistake. Caldwell's business partner, a man named Samuel Pierce, described what happened in a deposition taken years later for an unrelated legal matter. John started acting strange on the 2nd day, kept going to look at the green-eyed Negro, wouldn't say why. On the 3rd day, he told me he was getting out of the business. Just like that, after 15 years. Said he couldn't do it anymore, couldn't live with himself. I thought he'd lost his mind. He sold his entire operation within a month and moved to Street Louis. Last I heard, he was working as a clerk in a dry goods store. Marcus was sold again. And again. And again. By March of 1851, he'd been through 11 owners. The price kept dropping. $500, $450, $400, $350. Each transaction recorded in ledgers that told a story no one wanted to read, each seller unable to explain why they were taking such devastating losses. The pattern was so consistent that it began attracting attention in New Orleans commercial circles, not public attention. These were private conversations in coffee houses, in the offices of cotton factors, in the counting rooms where men discussed business away from public scrutiny. A sugar planter named Armand Delacroix wrote to his brother in Baton Rouge in early March. "There is a curious situation developing in the slave markets. A Negro with an unusual eye color has been sold repeatedly at escalating losses. Each owner reports the same experience. The slave performs adequately, causes no trouble, but within days, the owner becomes desperate to be rid of him. I would dismiss this as superstitious nonsense, except that several men I know personally, men of sound judgment and considerable experience, have been affected. They will not discuss it openly, but their discomfort is evident." The rumors spread. Some said the man carried disease, though medical examinations found him healthy. Others whispered about African conjuring, though the more educated dismissed this as primitive superstition. A few suggested he was somehow poisoning his owners' minds, though no one could explain the mechanism. What none of these men understood, what they couldn't allow themselves to understand, was that Marcus wasn't doing anything to them. He was simply forcing them to see what was already there. In mid-March, Marcus was purchased by a man named Thomas Garrett, who owned a cotton plantation called Thornfield in Concordia Parish, across the river from Natchez. Garrett had heard the rumors and dismissed them as the foolishness of weak men. He'd been a plantation owner for 23 years. He'd managed over 200 slaves without incident. He believed that proper discipline and firm authority were all that any situation required. Garrett paid $350 for Marcus, confident he'd gotten a bargain. "Let the superstitious fools waste their money," he told his overseer. "I'll put this one to work, and that will be the end of it." Thornfield was different from the sugar plantations downriver. Cotton was a different crop, required different rhythms of labor. The fields stretched toward the horizon, white with cotton ready for picking. The enslaved people worked in long lines, dragging cotton sacks that grew heavier with each passing hour, their fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls, their backs bent under the merciless sun. Marcus was placed in the picking gang. He worked with the same mechanical competence he'd shown everywhere else. He learned quickly, picked clean, caused no trouble. For 3 days, everything seemed normal. But on the 4th day, something happened that Garrett's overseer, a man named Daniel Hooks, recorded in his private diary. The diary survived in his family's papers and was discovered by a researcher in the 1920 seconds, long after everyone involved was dead. March 19, 1851. Something is wrong at Thornfield, though I cannot identify what. The new Negro, the one with the green eye, works adequately, but the others have begun to change around him. Not in obvious ways. They still work, still follow orders, but there's a quality to their compliance that troubles me. It feels performed rather than genuine. As if they're maintaining the appearance of submission while something else is happening beneath the surface. I mentioned this to Master Garrett. He dismissed my concerns as imagination. Perhaps he's right, but I find myself increasingly uncomfortable in Marcus's presence. Not because he does anything threatening, because when I look at him, I feel as though he can see straight through me. I can see every compromise I've made, every cruelty I've justified, every time I've chosen my wages over my conscience. March 20th. I have decided to seek other employment. I cannot explain this decision rationally, but I know I cannot continue at Thornfield while that man is here. The master thinks I'm being foolish. Perhaps I am. But I would rather be called a fool than spend another week feeling the way I feel when Marcus looks at me. Daniel Hooks left Thornfield on March 21st, forfeiting 2 months' salary rather than work out his notice. Garrett was forced to supervise the field work himself while he searched for a new overseer, and that meant spending time in close proximity to Marcus. Later accounts suggest that Garrett lasted 3 days before his own certainty began to crack. A letter from Garrett's wife to her sister, dated March 25th, provides a glimpse into what happened. Thomas has become troubled in spirit. He will not discuss the cause, but I have never seen him so agitated. He spends hours in his study, drinks more than is his custom, and speaks of matters that make no sense to me. Yesterday he said, "We have built our entire civilization on a foundation of sand. We have told ourselves stories about natural order and divine providence. But what if those stories are lies? What if we've simply chosen to believe them because the truth is unbearable?" I am worried for his health. On March 27th, the 18th day after purchasing Marcus, Thomas Garrett did something unprecedented. He called together all the enslaved people on his plantation and told them he was freeing them. All of them. 147 people. The announcement caused chaos. Garrett's wife fainted. His adult son, who'd been learning to manage the plantation, argued that his father had lost his mind. Neighboring planters, hearing the news, rode to Thornfield to talk sense into him, but Garrett was unmoved. In a letter he wrote that day to his banker in Natchez, explaining why he would need to liquidate assets to manage the financial catastrophe he was creating, he said, "I have come to see that I have spent 23 years participating in a monstrous evil. I have owned human beings as property. I have told myself it was necessary, natural, ordained by God, but I have been lying to myself. A man helped me see this, though he spoke hardly a word to me. He simply existed in a way that made my lies impossible to maintain. I cannot continue. I will not continue. Let the financial consequences be what they may. Garrett's family had him evaluated by doctors. They found him sane. His decision stood. He freed all his slaves, sold Thornfield at a devastating loss, and moved to Ohio, where he spent the remainder of his life working as a school teacher and writing essays against slavery that were published in abolitionist newspapers. But Marcus, the man who triggered this transformation, didn't gain his freedom in Garrett's mass emancipation. Before Garrett had announced his decision, he'd sold Marcus to a slave trader named William Jennings for $300. Jennings specialized in the interstate trade, moving slaves from the Upper South to the Deep South, where labor was scarce and prices were high. He was a hard man, practical and unsentimental. When other traders warned him about Marcus, about the pattern of sales and the rumors surrounding him, Jennings laughed. "You're telling me that a Negro slave can make masters uncomfortable just by existing? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. He's probably clever, probably manipulative. But I've dealt with clever slaves before. They learn quickly enough when they meet someone who won't be manipulated." Jennings kept Marcus in his holding facility in Natchez for 5 days, while he assembled a coffle of slaves for transport to Mississippi's interior cotton regions. The facility was a converted warehouse, fortified and guarded, where Jennings kept the human merchandise he was moving. On the second day, Jennings's assistant, a young man named Robert Hayes, who'd been working in the slave trade for 2 years, quit abruptly. He left a note saying only, "I cannot continue in this employment. My conscience will not permit it." On the third day, one of the guards, a man known for his brutality toward the imprisoned slaves, asked to be reassigned to any duty that didn't involve contact with Marcus. When Jennings demanded an explanation, the guard said, "When that green-eyed one looks at me, I feel like I'm being weighed and found wanting. I don't like it. I won't work near him." On the fourth day, Jennings himself went to examine Marcus to see what was causing these reactions. He found Marcus sitting quietly in his cell, hands folded, expression neutral. Jennings stood there for several minutes, studying him. "What are you?" Jennings finally asked. Marcus looked at him with one brown eye and one green eye, and said nothing. "What do you do to people?" Jennings pressed. "What trick are you playing?" Marcus spoke then, the first words recorded in any account. His voice was calm, educated, startlingly articulate. "I play no tricks, sir. I do nothing to anyone. I simply exist. If my existence causes discomfort, perhaps you should ask yourself why that might be." Jennings reported later, in a conversation with a colleague that was documented in the colleague's diary, that Marcus's words haunted him. He was right. The question wasn't what he was doing. The question was why his mere presence, his simple existence as an intelligent, articulate, fully human person, made me so uncomfortable. And once I asked myself that question, I couldn't stop asking it. I couldn't stop examining my own life, my own choices, the business I'd built. On the fifth day, William Jennings sold Marcus for $250 and closed his slave trading operation. Within a month, he'd moved to Indiana and opened a dry goods store. He never spoke publicly about his decision, but he wrote in a private letter to a friend, "I could no longer participate in something that required me to lie to myself every day about what I was doing and who I was becoming." By April 1851, Marcus had been sold 16 times. His value had dropped from $1,400 to $250. The combined losses to his various owners exceeded $5,000, more than enough to have purchased his freedom several times over. But no one was offering him freedom. They were just passing him along, selling him at losses they could barely afford, desperate to be rid of him, unable to articulate why. The story was spreading now, beyond New Orleans, beyond the Mississippi River parishes. Plantation owners in Alabama heard about it. Cotton factors in Memphis discussed it. Even in Charleston, South Carolina, where the domestic slave trade had deep roots and long traditions, People were talking about the slave with the green eye who could break a master's will in 7 days. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't let themselves understand, was that Marcus wasn't breaking anything. He was just showing them what was already broken. He was holding up a mirror, and in that mirror they saw themselves clearly for the first time, and what they saw was unbearable. A New Orleans physician named Dr. Charles Mercier became fascinated by the case. Mercier had interests in mental medicine, the emerging field that would eventually become psychiatry. He began collecting testimony from men who'd owned Marcus, trying to understand the psychological mechanism at work. Most refused to speak with him. Those who did couldn't provide useful information. They spoke in generalities, in vague terms about discomfort and unease. They couldn't or wouldn't describe the specific experience of being in Marcus's presence, of meeting his gaze, of feeling whatever it was they felt. But Dr. Mercier was persistent. He tracked down several former owners and conducted what we might call interviews. His notes, preserved in the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society, provide the most detailed account we have of Marcus's psychological impact. Samuel Pritchard, a cotton planter who'd owned Marcus for 6 days in February, told Dr. Mercier, "I cannot explain what happened. The Negro did nothing wrong. He worked well, caused no trouble, attempted no escape. But after 3 days, I began to feel increasingly agitated. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't concentrate on my work. I found myself questioning things I'd never questioned before. Why do I own other human beings? By what right? What have I become? These thoughts were unbearable. I had to make them stop. The only way to make them stop was to sell him." Another former owner, a sugar planter named Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, was more specific. "The green eye sees everything, not like a normal person sees. It's as though he can look into your soul and see all the compromises you've made, all the lies you've told yourself, and once he's seen them, you can see them too. You can't unsee them. It's like waking up from a dream and realizing your entire life has been based on a fiction." Dr. Mercier's analysis, written in May 1851 but never published, suggested that Marcus possessed an unusual combination of intelligence and perceptiveness that allowed him to understand the psychological mechanisms by which slaveholders justified their actions. "The institution of slavery," Mercier wrote, "requires constant psychological work from those who benefit from it. They must convince themselves that enslaved people are not fully human, or that slavery is somehow natural and right, or that they personally are benevolent masters. This self-deception is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. Any person or circumstance that interferes with this self-deception becomes threatening. The slave called Marcus appears to interfere with this process simply by being, obviously, undeniably, fully human in his intelligence and bearing. His presence forces slaveholders to confront the gap between their self-image and their actual actions. For many, this confrontation is psychologically unbearable. In late April 1851, a consortium of slave traders pooled their resources to solve what they were now calling the Marcus problem. These were practical men, businessmen who'd made fortunes in the domestic slave trade. They didn't believe in conjuring or supernatural explanations, but they recognized a threat to their business when they saw one. The rumors were spreading, buyers were becoming cautious, questions were being asked. If one slave could cause such consistent psychological distress to his owners, what did that suggest about the stability of the entire system? What did it say about the men who'd built their lives on human bondage? The consortium's solution was simple: remove Marcus from circulation entirely. Transport him somewhere so remote, so isolated, that his influence couldn't spread. Work him until he broke or died. Either way, end the problem. They purchased Marcus for $200 from his 16th owner and arranged transport to a cotton plantation in the Red River region of northern Louisiana, near the Texas border. The plantation was called Blackwater, and it had a reputation as one of the harshest operations in the state. Blackwater's owner was a man named Silas Brennan. Brennan was known throughout the region for his brutality. He believed that enslaved people responded only to overwhelming force, that any hint of independence needed to be crushed immediately. His plantation had the highest injury rate in the parish. Visiting planters whispered about the conditions there, though few dared criticize him openly. The consortium members met with Brennan personally. They explained the situation, the pattern of sales, the psychological effects Marcus seemed to produce. Brennan listened and laughed. "You're telling me that hardened plantation owners, men who've managed hundreds of slaves, are being broken by one African who does nothing but look at them? That's pathetic. Send him to me. I'll show you how to handle a difficult Negro." Marcus arrived at Blackwater on May 3, 1851. He was placed immediately in the cotton gang, the hardest work on the plantation. Brennan made a point of establishing dominance from the first moment. He had Marcus brought before the assembled enslaved population and announced that this was a slave who'd caused trouble elsewhere but would cause no trouble here. "I've heard stories about you," Brennan told Marcus in front of everyone. "Stories about how you make masters uncomfortable. Well, I'm not uncomfortable. You're going to work my fields like every other Negro here, and if you give me any trouble at all, you'll learn what real discomfort feels like." Marcus said nothing. He simply looked at Brennan with his mismatched eyes, one brown, one green, completely calm. The assembled enslaved people watched in silence. Later, several of them would describe that moment to others, and their accounts would spread through the underground networks of communication that existed beneath the surface of plantation society. A woman named Sarah, who worked in Brennan's house, later told a story that was passed down through her family and eventually recorded by historians in the 1932. When the new man looked at Master Brennan, something changed in the air. You could feel it. The master was trying to establish his power, trying to make the new man afraid. But the new man wasn't afraid. He just stood there, looking at the master like he could see right through him. And for just a moment, just a flash, I saw fear in Master Brennan's eyes. Then it was gone, and he was shouting and carrying on like usual. But I'd seen it, and I knew something was going to happen. For the first week, Marcus worked the cotton fields from dawn until after dark. The work was brutal. The heat was merciless. Brennan's overseers drove the workers hard, using the whip freely on anyone who slowed down. Marcus kept pace. He picked cotton cleanly, filled his sack, dumped it at the weighing station, and returned to the fields. He showed no emotion, no fatigue, no resistance. He simply worked. But something was happening at Blackwater, something subtle but unmistakable. The other enslaved people began to change around Marcus, not in obvious ways. They still worked, still obeyed orders, still maintained the appearance of submission, but there was a quality to their bearing that troubled the overseers. A quiet confidence, a sense of self-possession that hadn't been there before. One of the overseers, a man named Jack Porter, mentioned it to Brennan on the 8th day. "The green-eyed one isn't causing any direct trouble, but the others are different around him. Can't explain it exactly. Just feels like they're less afraid than they should be." Brennan went to the fields himself to observe. What he saw confirmed Porter's concerns. The enslaved people were working, but there was something in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that looked almost like hope. That night, Brennan ordered Marcus brought to the yard behind the main house. This was where Brennan conducted his most severe punishments, away from the main quarters but visible enough that word would spread. Brennan had decided to break Marcus through direct confrontation. He would demonstrate publicly and unmistakably that no slave at Blackwater was beyond his power to humble. Marcus was tied to the whipping post. The other enslaved people were not assembled to watch. Brennan's punishments were usually private, but several people in the nearby quarters could see and hear what happened. Brennan took the whip himself. He announced that Marcus would be whipped not for any specific offense, but as a demonstration that every slave at Blackwater understood their place. The first strike fell. Marcus made no sound. The second strike. Silence. The third, fourth, fifth. Marcus stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on some distant point, his expression unchanged. 10 strokes, 15, 20. The whip cut through his shirt, through his skin, drawing blood that ran down his back. Marcus never made a sound, never flinched, never begged for mercy. At 25 strokes, something happened that witnesses described as almost supernatural, though it was entirely human. Marcus turned his head and looked directly at Brennan. One brown eye, one green eye, both completely calm, completely present, and he spoke. "You can beat me until I die," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the pain. "But you cannot make me believe I deserve this, and you cannot make yourself believe it either. Not anymore. Not now that you've looked into my eyes and seen that I am exactly as human as you are." Brennan dropped the whip. Multiple witnesses in the quarters later reported that the plantation owner stood there for a long moment, trembling, his face twisted with some emotion they couldn't name. Then he turned and walked into his house. The next morning, Brennan's wife wrote to her sister, "Silas has become strange. He spent all last night in his study, drinking and muttering to himself. This morning he announced that he's selling the plantation. All of it. Says he can no longer continue in this life. I am frightened and confused. I don't know what has happened to him." But before Brennan could arrange the sale of his plantation, before he could make any decisions about his future, something else happened. Something that would become legend in the whispered histories that enslaved people told each other. On the night of May 12th, 9 days after Marcus arrived at Blackwater, Silas Brennan went to the slave quarters alone. This was unprecedented. Masters didn't visit the quarters at night, especially not alone. Several people saw him. He went directly to the cabin where Marcus was housed with 5 other men. He asked to speak with Marcus privately. What was said in that conversation, no one knows for certain. But a man named Isaiah, who slept in the same cabin, later testified that Brennan was in there for nearly an hour. When he emerged, he was weeping. The next morning, Silas Brennan freed Marcus. Just Marcus. Not the other enslaved people at Blackwater, just the one man with the green eye. He provided him with papers documenting his manumission, gave him $50 in gold, and arranged for transportation to New Orleans. Brennan's family tried to have him declared insane. They argued that no rational man would free a valuable slave after owning him for 9 days, especially not after investing in his punishment. But the doctors who examined Brennan found him completely lucid. When asked why he'd freed Marcus, Brennan gave an answer that was recorded in the legal documents surrounding the manumission. "I have spent 15 years building Blackwater into one of the most profitable plantations in the region. I have done things, terrible things, to maintain discipline and maximize production. I have told myself these things were necessary, that the enslaved people were suited for this life, that I was simply managing my property efficiently. But 9 days ago, a man arrived at my plantation who made me see the truth. Not through rebellion or violence or even words, just through existing. Through looking at me and making me see myself clearly, I realized that I have become a monster. That the institution of slavery has turned me into something inhuman. I cannot undo what I've done, but I can stop doing it. Freeing this one man is not justice, it's not redemption. It's simply the only thing I can do that feels like a step toward becoming human again." Brennan sold Blackwater 3 months later and moved to Illinois. He spent the rest of his life working as a carpenter and writing anonymous essays against slavery that appeared in abolitionist newspapers. Marcus, now legally free, disappeared from the historical record at this point. The manumission papers document his freedom but provide no information about where he went or what he did afterward. But his impact continued to ripple outward. By summer of 1851, at least 23 men who'd owned or dealt with Marcus had experienced significant life changes. 7 had left the slave trade entirely. 4 had freed some or all of their slaves. 2 had moved north and become active in abolitionist circles. 1 had taken his own life. The story spread through both the white and black communities of the South, but it meant different things to different people. Among slaveholders, it was a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of educated slaves, of Africans who refused to internalize their supposed inferiority. Some plantations began implementing stricter rules against slaves, learning to read or showing signs of independent thought. But among enslaved people, the story of Marcus carried a different message. It was a story about the power of dignity, of self-possession, of simply refusing to accept the role assigned to you. Marcus had never rebelled violently. He'd never attempted escape until he was legally freed. He'd simply existed as a fully human, fully intelligent person in a system that required him to be seen as less than human. And that existence, that refusal to internalize oppression, had been enough to shake the certainty of dozens of slaveholders, had been enough to make them question the entire foundation of their lives. A song emerged in the slave quarters throughout Louisiana in the months after Marcus disappeared. It was never written down, but fragments were remembered and recorded decades later by researchers collecting slave songs. One eye sees the truth. One eye sees the lie. Green eye sees your soul when he passes by. Can't whip what he knows, can't chain what he sees. Man who knows himself will always be free. The song spread from plantation to plantation, carried by the invisible networks of communication that white Southerners never fully understood. It was sung quietly, in the quarters at night, in the fields when overseers were far away. It was a song of resistance, but a particular kind of resistance. Not violent rebellion, but the assertion of inner freedom that no amount of physical bondage could suppress. Dr. Charles Mercier, the physician who'd been studying Marcus's psychological impact, wrote a final analysis in June 1851 that he never attempted to publish. He knew it was too dangerous, too threatening to the social order he lived in. I have come to understand, Mercier wrote, that the institution of slavery is more fragile than its defenders believe. It depends not on physical force alone, but on a complex psychological system that requires constant maintenance. Enslaved people must be convinced of their own inferiority. Slaveholders must be convinced of their own righteousness. Any person or circumstance that disrupts these beliefs threatens the entire structure. The man called Marcus possessed a rare combination of intelligence, education, and psychological insight that allowed him to see through this system completely. He understood that slaveholders had trapped themselves in a web of lies and self-deception, and that they desperately needed to maintain those lies, to live with themselves. His strategy, if it can be called that, was simply to exist in a way that made those lies impossible to maintain. He didn't argue or rebel or resist, he simply was, fully human, fully intelligent, fully present. And in his presence, slaveholders were forced to see the truth, that they had built their lives on a monstrous evil, and that all their justifications were hollow. For men who had invested everything, their fortunes, their social standing, their self-image in the righteousness of slavery, this realization was unbearable. Some chose to change their lives rather than continue living with what Marcus had made them see. Others simply passed him along, desperate to restore the comfortable delusions that allowed them to sleep at night. What Marcus demonstrated is that the greatest threat to oppression is not violence but clarity, the simple, unflinching recognition of truth. He showed that enslaved people could see their oppressors with perfect understanding, could recognize the psychological weaknesses beneath the displays of power, and he showed that this seeing, this understanding, was itself a form of power that no chains could suppress. After Marcus disappeared from the historical record in May 1851, the question everyone wanted answered was simple. What happened to him? A legally free man of color with $50 in gold and manumission papers could, theoretically, build a life. But the reality was far more complicated. Free people of color in the antebellum South existed in a precarious legal and social space. They were free, but not equal. They faced constant suspicion, restrictive laws, and the ever-present threat that their papers could be questioned or their freedom challenged. A black man traveling alone, even with documentation, was vulnerable. Several possible sightings were reported over the following years, though none were confirmed. A steamboat captain claimed to have transported a free man of color with one green eye from New Orleans to Cincinnati in June 1851. A Quaker abolitionist in Philadelphia mentioned in a letter that he'd met a remarkable freedman from Louisiana bearing an unusual ocular condition at an anti-slavery meeting in 1852. A schoolteacher in Toronto reported encountering a highly educated black man who matched Marcus's description in 1853. But these accounts are fragmentary, unreliable, possibly referring to different people entirely. The truth is that Marcus, like so many people who passed through slavery's machinery, vanished from documented history. His story became legend instead of fact, myth instead of biography. What didn't vanish was his impact. Throughout the 1,850 seconds, as tensions between North and South intensified and the nation moved inexorably toward civil war, the story of Marcus continued to circulate in both white and black communities, evolving with each retelling. Among enslaved people, the story carried weight far beyond one man's experience. It was repeated in the quarters at night, woven into songs, passed from plantation to plantation through the invisible networks of communication that white people never fully detected. A woman named Rachel, who'd been enslaved in Mississippi and escaped to Canada in 1856, later told an interviewer, "We all knew the story of the man with the green eye. It gave us hope, not because he'd escaped or led a rebellion, but because he'd shown that the masters weren't as powerful as they pretended to be. He'd shown that their certainty was fragile, that they were afraid of us in ways they couldn't admit. Knowing that changed how we saw ourselves and how we saw them. This shift in consciousness, this recognition that enslaved people could understand their oppressors better than the oppressors understood themselves, was subtle but significant. It didn't lead to immediate uprisings or mass escapes, but it created a psychological foundation for resistance that would prove important in the years to come. Among white Southerners, particularly slaveholders, the Marcus story functioned differently. It was a source of anxiety, a reminder that the system they'd built was more psychologically fragile than they wanted to admit. The laws that several Southern states passed in the early 1,850 seconds, making it illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write, were officially justified as security measures to prevent slave rebellions. But the timing suggests they were also responses to the deeper threat that Marcus represented, the threat of enslaved people who could see clearly, think independently, and refuse to internalize their supposed inferiority. A South Carolina legislator named Edmund Ravenel wrote in a private letter in 1852, "The recent laws regarding slave literacy are necessary not because educated Negroes will necessarily rebel violently, but because they will rebel psychologically. They will refuse to accept the natural order. They will look at us and see not masters ordained by God, but merely men who have chosen to benefit from an evil system. And if enough of them see us that clearly, the entire structure becomes untenable." Ravenel understood what many of his contemporaries refused to acknowledge, that slavery depended not just on physical force, but on psychological acceptance. Both the enslaved and the enslavers needed to believe in the system, or at least not question it too deeply. Marcus had demonstrated that this psychological foundation could be shattered simply through the presence of someone who refused to believe, who insisted on his own full humanity regardless of circumstances. The men whose lives Marcus had directly affected followed various paths in the years that followed. Thomas Garrett, the plantation owner who'd freed all his slaves after encountering Marcus, became a vocal abolitionist in Ohio. He wrote essays, gave speeches, and contributed financially to anti-slavery causes. In an 1857 essay titled "My Conversion from Slavery," he described his transformation without naming Marcus directly. "I was raised to believe that slavery was natural and right, ordained by God and beneficial to all involved. I managed my plantation with what I believed was fairness and efficiency. Then I encountered a man who made me see the truth. that I had been lying to myself every day for 23 years, that the enslaved people I owned were exactly as human as I was, with the same capacity for thought, feeling, and moral reasoning, that I had built my prosperity on their suffering and justified it with elaborate fictions. Once I saw this clearly, I could not continue. The financial cost of freeing my slaves was significant, but far less than the moral cost of keeping them. Etienne Marchant, the sugar planter from Belle Rive, took a different approach. He didn't free his enslaved people or abandon his plantation, but he dramatically changed how he managed it. He reduced work hours, improved living conditions, prohibited whipping except in extreme circumstances, and began paying small wages that enslaved people could save toward purchasing their freedom. Other planters criticized him as soft, predicted his operation would fail, but Marchant's plantation remained profitable, and several enslaved people did eventually purchase their freedom through the wages he paid. In a letter to a cousin in 1854, Marchant explained, "I cannot undo the evil I have participated in, but I can reduce the suffering I cause. It is not redemption, but it is something." Raymond Fouché, the slave trader who'd first purchased Marcus in New Orleans, closed his business and moved to New York, where he worked as a clerk. He never spoke publicly about his reasons for leaving the slave trade, but he contributed anonymously to abolitionist organizations for the rest of his life. Not all the men who'd encountered Marcus changed so dramatically. Some simply sold him and tried to forget the experience, burying their discomfort beneath renewed commitment to the system that had made them wealthy. But even among those who didn't change their lives, something had shifted. A seed of doubt had been planted. By 1860, as the nation stood on the brink of war, the psychological certainty that had sustained Southern slaveholders for generations was cracking. Not just because of Marcus, of course. The abolitionist movement, slave rebellions, political conflicts, economic pressures, all these played their parts. But Marcus had demonstrated something crucial, that the emperor had no clothes, that the elaborate justifications for slavery were transparent to anyone willing to look clearly. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, it was fought over many issues: states' rights, economic systems, political power. But at its core was a moral question. Could one group of human beings own another group as property? The answer, written in blood over 4 years of devastating conflict, was no. In the decades after the war, as formerly enslaved people began telling their stories to historians and researchers, the legend of Marcus appeared in various forms. Sometimes he was called Marcus, sometimes other names. Sometimes the green eye was described as blue or grey. The details varied, but the core story remained consistent. A man who'd been sold repeatedly because his presence made slaveholders unbearably uncomfortable, not through violence or rebellion, but simply through existing as an undeniably, unmistakably human person. One of the most detailed accounts came from an interview conducted in 1897 with a woman named Harriet Webb, who'd been enslaved in Louisiana and was 89 years old at the time of the interview. She'd heard the Marcus story as a young woman and remembered it vividly. The old folks used to tell us about the man with the different colored eyes, who could make masters see themselves truly. They said he'd been a scholar in Africa before he was captured, that he'd learned the white man's language and the white man's learning, and he used that knowledge to understand them better than they understood themselves. He didn't have to do anything but look at them, really look at them, and they'd see what they were, see that they'd built their whole lives on a lie, see that the people they owned were just as human as they were, and that meant everything they'd done was wrong. Most folks can't live with that kind of truth, so they'd sell him and try to forget. But we never forgot, because he showed us something important, that we could see them clearly, understand them completely, and they couldn't see us at all. They could only see what they needed us to be. And that was their weakness. That was how we knew we'd win eventually, even when it seemed impossible. Because you can't build a forever kingdom on lies, and slavery was nothing but lies. The story that Harriet and others told wasn't primarily about one man's suffering or even his freedom. It was about psychological resistance, about maintaining dignity and self-knowledge in a system designed to strip both away. It was about the power of seeing clearly and refusing to accept the stories that oppression tells. In the years after Reconstruction, as the promise of freedom gave way to Jim Crow segregation and new forms of racial oppression, the Marcus story continued to circulate in black communities. It evolved, adapted to new circumstances, but retained its core message: that clarity of vision is itself a form of power, that understanding your oppressor is a kind of freedom they can't take away. Here at the Sealed Room, we've spent months researching this story, tracking down fragmentary records, comparing different versions of the legend, trying to separate historical fact from mythological embellishment. The truth is that much of Marcus's story exists in that uncertain space between history and legend, documented enough to be credible, but fragmentary enough to require interpretation. What we know for certain: a man matching Marcus's description was sold at least 16 times in Louisiana between January and May 1851, with each sale resulting in significant financial losses to the seller. Multiple plantation owners who encountered him either freed their slaves or left the slave trade entirely. The pattern was consistent enough and unusual enough to generate contemporary commentary from both white and black sources. What we believe but cannot prove conclusively: that Marcus was an educated African, possibly from a merchant or scholarly family, who understood English and European culture before his enslavement; that he possessed unusual psychological insight that allowed him to understand the mechanisms by which slaveholders justified their actions; that he used this understanding not to rebel violently, but to simply exist in a way that made their self-deception impossible to maintain. What we know matters more than what we can prove. Marcus's story, whether entirely factual or partially legendary, tells us something crucial about slavery and resistance. It shows us that oppression depends not just on physical force, but on psychological acceptance. That the oppressed often understand the oppressors better than the oppressors understand themselves. And that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is simply refusing to internalize the lies that oppression requires. The question of what happened to Marcus after May 1851 remains unanswered. Did he make it to the North? Did he escape to Canada? Did he die in circumstances that went unrecorded? We don't know. What we know is that his impact outlived him, whatever his fate. The men whose certainties he shattered went on to change their lives. The enslaved people who heard his story found in it a source of hope and psychological resistance, and the system he challenged, though it would take a war to destroy it, was revealed to be far more fragile than it appeared. In the end, Marcus's story is not about one man's individual triumph or tragedy. It's about the power of human dignity in the face of dehumanization. About the strength that comes from seeing clearly when the world demands you accept comfortable lies. About the quiet, persistent resistance of simply being yourself, fully and completely, regardless of what role oppression tries to force you into. Slavery ended more than 160 years ago, but the lessons of Marcus's story remain relevant. In any system of oppression, psychological manipulation works alongside physical force. The oppressed are taught to internalize their supposed inferiority. The oppressors are taught to believe in their own righteousness, and the system depends on both groups maintaining these beliefs, or at least not questioning them too deeply. Marcus showed what happens when someone refuses to play along. When someone insists on their full humanity and sees their oppressor with complete clarity. The result isn't always freedom, at least not immediately. But it's always threatening to the system, always dangerous to those who benefit from it. That's why his story was buried, why it exists now only in fragments and legends. Because it revealed something that defenders of slavery desperately needed to hide, that their power was not absolute, their justifications were transparent, and the people they enslaved could see through everything. What do you think? Could one person really have this kind of impact simply through clarity of vision and refusal to accept dehumanization? Or is this story exaggerated, a legend created to serve the psychological needs of people resisting oppression? The historical evidence suggests something remarkable happened in Louisiana in 1851. A man was sold 16 times in 5 months at escalating losses. Multiple slaveholders experienced psychological crises after encountering him. The pattern was consistent, documented, and generated contemporary commentary. Whether every detail of the story is accurate, whether Marcus was exactly as he's been described, we may never know with certainty. But what we do know is enough to tell us something important about slavery, resistance, and the power of human dignity. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about resistance and power, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us what resonated with you most. And subscribe to The Sealed Room, because we're dedicated to uncovering these buried stories, these forgotten chapters of American history that challenge what we think we know about the past. The stories that get buried are often the ones that are most dangerous to comfortable narratives. Marcus's story threatened the mythology of slavery, revealed the psychological fragility beneath displays of absolute power. That's why it was hidden. That's why we're committed to bringing it back to light. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another sealed chapter from America's dark past.